It was early morning in the city. The streets were already waking up, cars passing by, people rushing for work, and the smell of fresh bread filling the air from a small bakery at the corner of the street. Inside the bakery, the owner, Clara Jenkins, was arranging loaves on the shelf, humming softly as she prepared for another busy day. Outside, a thin man stood near the door, his clothes old and worn out, his face tired but calm. His name was David Collins. He had been living on the streets for months now. Most days, people walked past him like he was invisible. Some gave him a few coins, others avoided his eyes completely. That morning, David stood there longer than usual. The smell of warm bread was too much to ignore. His stomach ached with hunger. He hadn't eaten properly for 2 days. He checked his pockets, hoping to find a coin or two, but all he found were bits of paper and dust. He looked at the window again. Inside, people were laughing, eating, and sipping coffee. He hesitated, then slowly walked inside the bakery. Clara looked up. "Good morning," she said, her tone polite but cautious. David nodded nervously. "Good morning. I was just wondering how much one loaf costs." $3, she replied. He swallowed hard. "I don't have that much. I was wondering if maybe you could let me have one. I can come back and pay when I get some money." "I promise," Clara frowned. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give things away for free. I have a business to run." David lowered his head. "I understand." He turned to leave, but his weak legs almost gave out. He stumbled, and his hand accidentally brushed the counter where the loaves were stacked. One loaf slipped and fell to the floor. Without thinking, David bent down and picked it up. At that exact moment, another customer shouted, "Hey! He's trying to steal!" The whole bakery went silent. Everyone turned to look. Clara's eyes widened. "Is that true?" she asked sharply. David froze. No, I wasn't stealing. I just dropped it, I swear." But the crowd had already made up their minds. To them, he was just another homeless man trying to grab food without paying. Clara came around the counter. "Put it back," she said firmly, "and leave my shop before I call the police." David's hands shook. "Please, ma'am." "I didn't mean to. I said leave," she shouted. People began whispering. Some looked at David with disgust, others with pity. His heart pounded as he put the bread back and slowly stepped outside. The humiliation was heavier than his hunger. As he stood on the sidewalk trying to hold back tears, he heard someone call out, "Hey, wait!" He turned around. It was a young woman standing near the bakery door. She had seen the whole thing. She walked over to him. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. David nodded, though his eyes were wet. "I'm fine. I shouldn't have come in. People are right to be careful." She looked at him for a moment. "No, people are too quick to judge. I saw what happened. You didn't steal anything." Her voice was kind, and for the first time that day, David felt seen. "Thank you," he said quietly. "What's your name?" she asked. "David," he replied. "Nice to meet you, David. I'm Emily." She smiled softly. "Come inside. I'll buy you that bread." He shook his head. "No, please. You don't have to do that." "I want to," she said firmly. "Come on." They walked back into the bakery. The same customers were still there, whispering among themselves. Clara looked uncomfortable when she saw them return. "Clara," Emily said calmly, "I'd like to buy that loaf for him." The owner blinked. "Oh, well, of course. If you're paying, that's fine." Emily handed over the money. Clara wrapped the bread silently and placed it on the counter. Emily took it and gave it to David. "Here," she said with a smile.
"Now it's officially yours." David held the loaf carefully as if it were gold.
"Thank you. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Emily replied. "Just eat." Clara stood there, arms crossed, feeling a mix of guilt and defensiveness. "You know," she said quietly, "it's not easy running a small shop." "People come in every day trying to take advantage," Emily nodded. "I understand that. But sometimes people aren't what they seem." Clara didn't reply. David and Emily stepped outside again. He sat down on the bench near the bakery and broke off a small piece of bread. He ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was the best meal he'd ever had. Emily sat beside him watching. "You live around here?" she asked. David shook his head. "No, I just move from place to place. I sleep near the park most nights. That must be hard." "It is," he admitted, "but I've learned to survive. Some people give me food. Some don't even look at me. I've stopped expecting much." Emily felt a lump in her throat. You shouldn't have to live like that. David smiled faintly. Life doesn't always go as we plan. For a while they sat in silence. The city moved around them. People hurrying to work, cars honking, the morning sun slowly rising higher. Can I ask you something? Emily said finally. Sure. When you told the lady you'd come back to pay, did you mean that? David looked at her. Of course. I never lie. I may not have money now, but I don't want charity. I just needed food to keep going. Emily nodded slowly. She could see honesty in his eyes, and also pain. Do you have anyone? Family, friends? She asked. He looked away. No, not anymore. The way he said it made Emily curious, but she didn't push further. She could tell it wasn't the right time. After a few moments, she said softly, Would you like a cup of coffee? There's a small cafe nearby. My treat. David hesitated again, but finally nodded. All right. Thank you. They walked to a small cafe around the corner. The waiter looked surprised to see them together, but Emily didn't care. She ordered 2 coffees and a muffin. As they sat, she watched him slowly sip the warm drink. His hands trembled slightly, but his face relaxed. It's been a long time since I sat like this, David said quietly. Like what? Like a person. Emily felt tears prick her eyes. You are a person, David, he smiled sadly. Not to most people. He looked out the window toward the bakery. The memory of the crowd, the stares, the harsh words, it all replayed in his head. I didn't steal, he whispered, almost to himself. I know, Emily said, and maybe others will too, one day. He nodded slowly. After finishing their coffee, Emily offered him a small bag with leftover muffins to take. You can keep these for later, she said. He thanked her again, deeply moved. It had been a long time since someone treated him kindly without expecting anything in return. As they stood to leave, Emily said, I work at a community center a few blocks from here. If you ever need help, food, clothes, or just someone to talk to, come by, okay? David gave a small nod. I will. You've done more for me today than most have done in years. They walked back to the corner where they first met. Emily waved goodbye and left for work. David sat there for a long while, holding the loaf of bread close to his chest. The morning sun warmed his face. Despite the humiliation earlier, he felt something different inside and a spark of hope. Maybe not everyone saw him as a thief. Maybe not everyone had forgotten his worth. But little did anyone know this small incident, a loaf of bread, a misunderstanding, and a stranger's kindness, was just the beginning. The truth about who David really was and what had brought him to this point would soon leave everyone speechless, and that truth, hidden behind those tired eyes and tattered clothes, was far more powerful than anyone could imagine. The days after the incident outside the bakery felt long to David, but in a way they were also full of quiet reflection. He spent most of his time near the park, wandering around the streets with his old worn backpack, sitting on benches, or simply walking aimlessly. The city had become familiar to him in a strange, painful way. He had learned the rhythms of life on the streets, the sounds of cars, the busy chatter of people, the quiet moments when no one looked his way. But despite the overwhelming loneliness, he couldn't forget the kindness Emily had shown him. She was different. She didn't look at him like others did. She didn't see him as just a homeless man. She saw him as a person. One afternoon, just a few days after they met, David found himself sitting on the same bench outside the bakery. The memory of the bread, the cold stares, and the embarrassment still haunted him. But Emily's kindness lingered, like a warm blanket in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important he had to do next. That's when he saw her again. Emily was walking down the street, her bag slung over her shoulder. She looked surprised when she spotted him. A small smile spread across her face as she waved and came over to him. Hey, David. How are you today? David hesitated, feeling awkward, but he smiled back. I'm all right. Just, trying to figure things out. I understand, Emily said, sitting down beside him on the bench. You know, I was thinking about you the other day. I was wondering if you were okay after all that happened at the bakery. David nodded, but his eyes looked distant. I'm fine. It's just, the usual. People don't understand, and I can't blame them. It's hard for them to see past the way I look. Emily gave him a sympathetic glance. You're right. It's easy for people to make assumptions, but I believe people have more to them than what you see on the surface. David looked down at his shoes, scuffing the dirt on the pavement. It had been a long time since someone had spoken to him like that. It felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders, even just for a moment. "You don't need to explain yourself to me, David," she said. "But if you ever want to, I'm here. You know, I work at the community center. We offer a lot of resources for people who need help, things like food, shelter, medical care. But we also offer something else, a place to talk, to share stories." David turned his head toward her. "Stories?" Emily smiled. "Yes, stories. Sometimes that's what people really need, someone to listen. I've seen how it can help. People who have been through things like you just need someone to understand, without judgment." David's heart tightened. No one had ever asked to hear his story before. They saw him as a man with nothing, a man who had lost everything. He couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed at the thought of telling her about his past. But deep down, he also felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe Emily was right. Maybe he had a story worth sharing. "Do you really think people care?" he asked quietly. "I think people want to care," Emily replied softly. "They just need to know how. They need to see the real person behind all the layers, and I think your story is one that can help others too." David paused, unsure of how to respond. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "You know, I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always on the streets." Emily's eyes softened. "I didn't think you were." David took a deep breath. He felt the words stuck in his throat, but there was something comforting about Emily's presence. He had spent so many years pushing his past away, locking it up inside. But now, with Emily sitting beside him, it almost felt safe to open up. "I used to have a family," David began, his voice quieter than usual. "A wife, a son. We lived in a little house just a few blocks from here. I had a job. I was doing okay. But then, things started falling apart. It was like one thing after another. First, my wife got sick. She was diagnosed with cancer, and the treatments drained our savings. I tried everything. I worked extra hours, took on side jobs, but it wasn't enough. The medical bills just kept coming. Then one night, she passed away." Emily listened closely, her eyes full of compassion. She didn't interrupt. David continued, his voice shaking a little. "After she died, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't even take care of myself, let alone my son. I thought maybe things would get better with time, but they didn't. I lost my job. The house went into foreclosure. And then, my son, he went to live with his aunt. I lost him too." His eyes were wet now, and he wiped his face with the back of his hand. Emily didn't say anything. She just waited, offering him the silence he needed. "I thought I could handle it all," David continued. "But I couldn't. I kept telling myself I was strong, that I could get through it. But in the end, I ended up losing everything. My wife, my son, my home, my dignity, all of it." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "I didn't want to be this person, the man who sleeps on benches, the one people cross the street to avoid. But here I am." Emily looked at him gently, not with pity, but with understanding. She placed a hand on his arm. "David, I'm so sorry you went through all of that. I can't imagine what it must have been like for you." He gave a small, sad smile. "I've learned to live with it. I had to. But that doesn't mean it's easy," she said. "You've been through so much, and yet you're still here. You're still fighting even if you don't realize it." David stared at the ground, his mind racing. He had never really thought of himself as a fighter. He had always felt defeated, like life had taken everything from him. But Emily was right. He was still here. He hadn't given up. "You've got a lot more fight in you than you think," she said, as if reading his thoughts. For a moment, David felt a spark of hope. A small one, but it was there. He hadn't given up yet, even if it felt like it at times. "Thank you," he said quietly. You don't know how much that means to me. Emily smiled. Of course. You're not alone in this, David. There's always help if you want it. And if you don't, that's okay too. But remember, your story matters. David looked at her, a weight lifting from his chest. I'll think about it, he said. Emily stood up, brushing off her pants. I have to get going, but don't forget what I said. If you need anything, I'm just a phone call away. David nodded. I won't forget. Thank you, Emily. Really. As she walked away, he watched her disappear into the crowd, feeling something in his chest he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over yet. Maybe there was more to him than the man who had lost everything. He sat there for a while, letting the weight of his past settle, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely lost. The next few days felt different for David. The warmth from Emily's words stayed with him, like a small flame that was trying to break through the fog of years of disappointment and struggle. He spent more time thinking about what she had said, about not being alone, about his story mattering, and about the idea that he could still fight. It wasn't easy. There were still days when hunger gnawed at him and the familiar ache of loneliness would swallow him whole. But something inside him had shifted. For the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could take small steps toward something better. He decided to go to the community center Emily had mentioned. It wasn't far from the park where he spent most of his days. The streets were busy, as usual, with people rushing to work or school, the honking of car horns filling the air. David walked slowly, his steps heavier than usual, but each one felt like a little victory. It was the first time in months he had left the park with the intention of doing something for himself. When he reached the community center, it was a small, welcoming building tucked between two larger shops. It didn't look like much from the outside, but there was something about it that felt different, less cold and judgmental than the world outside. He took a deep breath and walked through the doors. The inside was warm and smelled like fresh coffee and cleaning supplies. There were a few people sitting at tables, talking quietly, and a friendly woman behind the front desk who looked up when he entered. Hi there, can I help you with something? She asked with a smile. David hesitated, feeling the old nervousness creeping back, but he remembered Emily's words. You're not alone in this. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe he could ask for help. I'm just here to see what you offer, he said, his voice softer than he intended. The woman nodded. Sure. We have a lot of resources here. Food, clothes, medical care, and even counseling. We also have job training programs. If you want, I can show you around. David swallowed, his mind racing. He hadn't expected to be offered so much in such a simple, kind way. He felt a small flutter of hope. I'd like that, he said. She led him down a hallway, passing by rooms where people were talking to volunteers, getting help with resumes, and receiving meals. It all seemed so ordinary, yet it felt like a world away from the cold streets he had been living on. As they walked, she explained the different programs, but David found his attention drifting to something else. In one of the rooms, he noticed a bulletin board covered with job postings. Most of them were for warehouse positions or construction work, jobs that required a little skill but not too much experience. David looked at them for a long moment, his heart thumping in his chest. Could he really do this? Could he go back to working after everything that had happened? The woman noticed him staring at the board. Are you interested in any of these? She asked kindly. David felt a pang of uncertainty. I used to work in construction, he said, his voice quieter now. Before everything changed. She smiled at him. Well, that's a great start. We can help you get your resume updated and maybe we can even connect you with someone who's hiring. David wasn't sure what to say. Part of him wanted to believe it, but another part of him was terrified. He had been out of work for so long, and he didn't know if anyone would want to hire someone like him. But as the day went on, something shifted inside of him. He began to feel a small sense of possibility, something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe he wasn't completely lost after all. That afternoon, He signed up for a resume workshop. It was a simple step, but it felt like a big one. He had always thought that people in his position didn't get second chances, that once you were on the streets, that was it. But this place was different. There were people here who saw him as more than just a man without a home. They saw him as someone who could rebuild, someone who still had a story to tell, and someone who deserved a second chance. The following week, David returned to the center. He was nervous at first, unsure if he was really ready to take the next step, but when he arrived, he was greeted with the same warmth. The woman behind the desk handed him a packet with tips for creating a resume, and one of the volunteers, a young man named John, sat down with him to help him write it. John didn't judge him for his broken past. He didn't question why David had been homeless or why he had stopped working. Instead, he focused on what David could do, what he had done in the past. By the end of the session, David had a resume. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "I can help you apply for some of these jobs if you want," John said as David looked over his resume. David took a deep breath, then nodded. "Yes, I think I'd like that." That night, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: pride. For the first time, he was taking control of his life again. It wasn't a huge step, but it was a step. And for David, that was more than enough. Over the next few weeks, David kept going to the community center. He worked on his resume, applied for jobs, and even attended a few job interviews. Some didn't go well, but others did. He felt his confidence building with each passing day, and although he was still struggling, he began to feel less like a man who had nothing, and more like a man who was beginning to find his way back. One day, he got a call. It was from a construction company that had seen his resume and wanted to offer him a trial job, a short-term position, just to see how he worked. David could hardly believe it. He had done it. He had taken the first real step toward rebuilding his life. The day of his trial work, he put on the best clothes he had, a simple shirt and pants he'd gotten from the community center. He was nervous, but he was also excited. As he stood outside the building, he took a deep breath. This was it. The job wasn't glamorous. It was hard work lifting heavy materials and cleaning up the site, but it was work. It was a chance to prove to himself that he could still do something useful, something that mattered. At the end of the day, the supervisor came up to him. David held his breath, not knowing what to expect. "Good job today," the supervisor said, smiling. "We're happy with your work. If you want, we'd like to offer you a full-time position." David's heart leapt in his chest. He could hardly believe it. After all this time, after all the pain, he had found a way to start over. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I won't let you down." As he left the job site that day, David felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying finally lift. He wasn't just a man living on the streets anymore. He was someone with a future, someone with a purpose. It wasn't going to be easy. There would still be struggles ahead. But David had learned something important, that no matter how far you fall, there's always a chance to get back up. And sometimes, the smallest steps can lead to the biggest changes. The days after David landed the job at the construction company felt like a whirlwind. At first, he wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of him couldn't believe it was real, and another part of him couldn't wait to dive in. There was something about working with his hands, the physicality of it, that helped him forget, even if just for a moment, the struggles he'd been through. Every day, he woke up with a sense of purpose. He wasn't just drifting anymore. He had something to look forward to. The job wasn't easy, but it gave him structure. Every morning, he woke up early, took a quick shower, and put on the same clothes he'd worn for the last few weeks. Old but clean, clothes he got from the community center. He wasn't ashamed of them anymore. They were a reminder of how far he had come. He'd been on the job for about a month when his boss called him over during lunch one day. The sun was shining brightly and the sound of construction tools filled the air. The site was noisy with workers shouting across the yard, but David's heart skipped a beat when his boss waved him over. "Hey, David, can you come here for a second?" David wiped the sweat from his brow and walked over to where his boss was standing. The man was tall with a rough face and big hands, a guy who looked like he'd been in the construction business his whole life. "Listen," the boss started, "you've been doing a good job. We're impressed with your work, and I wanted to let you know that we're considering offering you a full-time position with a pay raise. How would you feel about that?" David's heart leaped. The words didn't quite sink in right away. For a moment, he felt like he was dreaming. He had started this job with so many doubts, convinced that he was just a temporary fix for the company. But now he had proven himself. They trusted him. "I'd be honored," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I really appreciate it." The boss smiled and slapped him on the back. "Good. We're glad to have you on the team." As David walked back to the worksite, a sense of pride washed over him. This was the kind of moment he had been waiting for, the kind of breakthrough he thought might never come. He could hardly believe how far he had come from the man who had once sat alone on that bench outside the bakery, feeling invisible and lost. That evening, after work, David returned to the community center. It had become more than just a place where he went for help. It was where he could connect with people who understood what it was like to be down on their luck. The staff there had been kind to him, and it was the only place where he felt like he wasn't being judged for the things that had happened to him. As he sat in one of the chairs in the small meeting room, he noticed the same woman behind the desk from his first visit. She smiled when she saw him. "Well, look who's back. How's the job going?" David couldn't stop the grin that spread across his face. "It's going great. They offered me a full-time position today." Her eyes widened and she clapped her hands together. "That's amazing. I'm so proud of you, David. You've worked hard for this." David felt a warmth spread through him, like the praise was a light filling the gaps in the cracks of his soul. He had earned it. It wasn't just given to him. It was the result of so many small steps, so many late nights and quiet days filled with doubt. But now the pieces were starting to come together. Over the next few weeks, David adjusted to his new life. With the full-time position came more responsibility, but it also brought more stability. He was able to get a small apartment near the construction site. It wasn't much, just a tiny studio with a mattress on the floor and a simple kitchen. But it was his own space, and that was enough for him. The walls were bare, but he didn't mind. He knew it was just the beginning. Living in a place that was his own, with a steady job to go to every day, started to change David in ways he didn't expect. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about living again, about waking up with a purpose. He started spending more time thinking about the future, about what he could do next. One evening, as he sat in his small apartment eating a simple dinner, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. "Hey David, how's everything going? I've been thinking about you. Would love to catch up soon." David smiled. He hadn't seen Emily in a while, but he often thought about their conversations. She had become someone he could trust, someone who had seen him for who he really was. He wasn't sure if it was possible to feel grateful for someone you barely knew, but Emily had helped him more than she realized. He quickly typed back, "Things are going well. I've got a full-time job now, and I've even got a small apartment. I'd love to catch up soon. Let me know when you're free." A few minutes later, she replied, "That's fantastic, David. I'm so proud of you. Let's meet up tomorrow. I'll bring some coffee. How about the park around noon?" David's heart swelled with warmth. Emily's support had been one of the things that had pushed him to keep going. Now he was finally starting to see the fruits of his efforts. The next day, David met Emily in the park. The weather was perfect, the sun shining brightly overhead. He felt a little nervous as he walked toward her, unsure of what to expect. When she saw him, her face lit up and she waved him over. "David, you look great," she said, giving him a big smile. "Thanks," David replied, feeling a little shy. "I'm doing all right." They sat down on a bench and Emily pulled out 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to David and they both took a sip in silence for a moment. "I'm really proud of you," she said, breaking the silence. "I knew you had it in you even when you didn't believe it yourself." David smiled, the words ringing true in his heart. "It hasn't been easy," he said, looking down at the coffee in his hands. "But I'm getting there," Emily nodded. "You know, I've been through a lot of tough times too, and I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that you don't have to do everything alone. You've come a long way, but there are still good people out there who want to see you succeed." David looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. "Yeah, I've realized that. I think I'm starting to believe that too." They sat there for a while, chatting about life, about the small victories and the things they still hoped for. Emily shared her own dreams, her own struggles, and David found himself listening, really listening, for the first time in a long time. By the time the sun started to set, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He wasn't done with his journey. There were still challenges ahead, moments where doubt would creep in, but he was no longer the man who had given up. He was the man who was still fighting, still building, still hoping, and that was more than enough. As the weeks passed, David's life began to feel like a dream he had been too afraid to even imagine before. Every morning he woke up in his small apartment, feeling a sense of ownership over his life. He wasn't living on the streets anymore. He was working hard, making money, and slowly but surely, building the future he had once thought was beyond reach. The work at the construction site was tough, but David had grown used to the long hours and hard labor. He found satisfaction in the physical work, in the way it kept his mind focused and his body active. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It was something he could be proud of. And with each passing day, he felt like he was getting closer to the life he had always wanted, the life he had never thought he'd have a chance at. At the same time, something inside David was changing. The more he worked, the more he learned about himself. He was starting to understand that his past didn't have to define him. The mistakes he had made, the struggles he had faced, didn't have to be the story he kept telling himself. He had the power to change his future, and the future didn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. One night, after a long day at work, David sat on the edge of his bed in his apartment. It was quiet, the kind of quiet he had longed for during his years on the streets. There were no loud noises or distractions, just the sound of his own thoughts. As he sat there, he thought about how far he had come. He thought about the first day he had stepped into the community center, about how lost he had felt, and how Emily had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. It had all started there, with a single conversation that had sparked something inside him. Now here he was, living in his own place, working a steady job and feeling like he finally had control over his life. It was the kind of feeling he hadn't allowed himself to hope for in years. A few days later, David received a message from the construction company. They were impressed with his work, and they wanted to offer him more responsibility. He would be overseeing a small team for a new project they had coming up. It was a big step, one that David wasn't sure he was ready for, but at the same time it was an opportunity he couldn't ignore. His heart raced when he saw the message. It was exciting, but it was also scary. He had never been in charge of a team before. He had always been the one following orders, not giving them. But David had learned one important thing over the past few months. The only way to grow was to face his fears, to push himself to try new things even when they felt uncomfortable. He called the supervisor, and they talked about the new role. They explained the expectations and the responsibilities that came with it. David listened carefully, absorbing every word. When the call ended, he sat in his apartment for a few minutes, deep in thought. He could feel the fear creeping in, the same fear that had always held him back in the past. But this time, instead of running from it, he faced it head on. The next day, he showed up at the construction site ready for the new challenge. It was an early start, the sun barely up and the air still cool from the night. David met with the team he would be supervising. They were experienced, skilled workers, and he couldn't help but feel a little out of place among them. But he reminded himself of how far he had come. He reminded himself that he had earned this. The first few days were nerve-wracking. David was still learning the ropes of leadership, and it wasn't easy. There were moments when he felt unsure of himself, when he doubted his ability to manage a team. But every time those thoughts crossed his mind, he pushed them away. He remembered all the times he had overcome obstacles before, all the small victories he had celebrated. If he could survive the streets, he could handle this. As the weeks went on, David became more comfortable in his new role. He learned how to communicate with his team, how to keep things running smoothly on the job site. He made mistakes, but he learned from them. Slowly, he gained the respect of his team. They saw that he was dedicated, that he cared about the work they were doing, and over time, they started to trust him. David's confidence grew with each passing day. He started to feel like he belonged at the construction site, like he was more than just a worker. He was a leader, and for the first time in years, he felt proud of what he was doing. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. One evening, as David was cleaning up after work, he received a call from Emily. They hadn't spoken much lately, but David always appreciated hearing from her. They talked for a while, and when the conversation turned to his work, David shared the news about his new position overseeing the team. "That's amazing, David," Emily said. "I'm so proud of you. You're really doing it, aren't you?" David smiled, feeling the warmth of her words. Yeah, I guess I am. It's not easy, but I feel like I'm finally on the right track. They talked for a while longer, and when the call ended, David couldn't help but feel grateful for her support. Emily had been there from the beginning, believing in him when no one else did. And now, here he was on the verge of something bigger than he had ever imagined. The next few weeks brought more change for David. He continued to work hard at the construction site, but he also began to think about other things, like his future. He had never really considered what he wanted long-term, but now, with the stability he had, he started to dream. Maybe one day he could own his own construction company. Maybe he could help others who had been through what he had. Give them the chance to rebuild their lives like he had. The possibilities were endless now, and that was a feeling David had never known before. One evening, as he sat in his apartment, thinking about all the changes in his life, he realized something. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. His past didn't haunt him as much as it used to. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first arrived at the community center. He had come a long way, and he was proud of how far he had come. But the most important thing was this: he had hope again. For the first time in a long time, he could see a future for himself, and that, he realized, was the greatest gift of all.